A single drop of blood on the wrong piece of parchment. That was all it took to summon the apocalypse to the stone steps of St. Mathurin's Hospital. She thought she was begging the local magistrate for guards. Instead, by sunrise, 300 silver wolves had surrounded her ward. The winter of 1412 was unforgiving, but the biting frost of the Oakhaven Valley was nothing compared to the cruelty of men. St. Mathurin's Hospital of the Afflicted sat on a jagged cliffside, a sprawling stone sanctuary originally built by monks, now run by a desperate order of healers. On the night of the winter solstice, the air inside the grand ward was thick with the scent of boiling myrrh, iron-rich blood, and fear. Julia Hastings plunged her hands into a basin of cold water, watching the water turn a muddy crimson. At 24, Julia was the senior healer of the ward. Her linen apron was ruined, heavy with the aftermath of Baron Hugh Montgomery's latest raid. Montgomery was a ruthless, land-hungry warlord who had decided that the neutral sanctuary of St. Mathurin's was harboring rebels. He wasn't entirely wrong. Beneath the floorboards of the maternity ward, Julia was hiding 12 wounded men from the Valley Resistance. "They've breached the lower bridge, Julia," whispered Beatrice, a younger nurse whose hands shook so violently she dropped a roll of bandages. "Montgomery's men. They have torches. They're slaughtering the stable hands." Julia dried her hands on a clean rag, her chest tight. She could hear the distant screams, the shattering of stained glass, and the guttural laughter of armored men echoing up the spiraling stone corridors. They had less than an hour before the mercenaries reached the upper levels. Once they did, no one would survive. Not the rebels, not the orphans in the East Wing, and certainly not the healers. "Go to the rookery," Julia ordered, pulling a scrap of heavy parchment from a wooden desk. "Prepare the fastest raven we have." "For what?" Beatrice cried. "Who is going to help us?" "Lord Tristan Caldwell," Julia said, dipping a quill into a well of dark ink. "He owes my father a debt. If he rides out from the eastern garrison now, his cavalry can intercept Montgomery before they breach the iron gates of the upper ward." Julia's hands trembled as she wrote the desperate plea. "St. Mathurin's is falling. Montgomery's hounds are at our door. In the name of God and the debt you owe the Hastings family, send your guard. We are dead by dawn without you." She reached for the wax to seal the letter. To guarantee Caldwell would read it, she needed to press her family's crest into the wax. But the desk was a chaotic mess of medicinal vials, bloody rags, and surgical tools. In her frantic search, she knocked over a tray of scalpels. One of the blades sliced deep into the palm of her hand. Julia gasped, pulling her hand back, but it was too late. Blood dripped heavily onto the parchment, pooling over the wet ink. "Julia, they're at the iron gates!" Beatrice screamed from the doorway. Panic seized her. There was no time to rewrite it. Julia grabbed a stick of black sealing wax, melting it over a nearby candle, and let it drip directly over her blood on the parchment. She reached blindly into the wooden drawer where she kept her family's signet ring. Her fingers brushed against cold metal, and she slammed it into the cooling wax without looking. It wasn't until she pulled her hand away that she realized her mistake. Pressed into the wax was not the Hastings family crest. It was a ring she had stripped from the body of a massive, nameless soldier who had died in her ward 5 years ago. A heavy silver band engraved with a snarling wolf's head, crowned with thorns. She kept it in the drawer because it felt strangely heavy, almost warm to the touch. There were 2 leather courier tubes on the desk. One was marked with the blue ribbon of the East, Caldwell's territory. The other was an unmarked, ancient black tube that the old monks had forbidden anyone to use, claiming it was bound to the dark forests of the north. Blinded by the pain in her hand and the adrenaline rushing through her veins, Julia shoved the blood-sealed parchment into the black tube, ran up the winding stairs to the rookery, and tied it to the leg of their strongest raven. "Fly east!" Julia shouted, tossing the bird into the freezing night sky. But the raven did not fly east. As if guided by an invisible magnetic force, the bird banked sharply against the wind, soaring directly north. Toward the howling peaks, toward the forbidden territory of the Lycanthian court. Julia collapsed against the stone sill, clutching her bleeding hand. She had sent her plea into the abyss. There was no cavalry coming. The screams from the lower levels faded into a terrifying, methodical silence by the 4th hour of the night. Montgomery's men were taking their time. They knew the healers were trapped. Julia, Beatrice, and 3 other nurses had barricaded the heavy oak doors of the main ward with iron beds, heavy wooden cabinets, and piles of stone rubble. Behind them, 40 patients huddled in the dark, weeping silently. Julia stood at the front of the barricade, gripping a heavy iron fire poker. Her injured hand was wrapped tightly in a linen strip, throbbing with a strange, burning intensity that she chalked up to infection. "They are at the door," Beatrice whispered, falling to her knees in prayer. Heavy boots echoed in the hall outside. The rattling of chainmail and the scrape of swords against stone sent a fresh wave of terror through the room. "Open the door, little birds," a gruff voice echoed from the corridor. It was Commander Thorne, Montgomery's right-hand man. "We only want the rebel scum. Give them to us and we'll make your deaths quick." Julia tightened her grip on the iron poker. "If you want them, you'll have to burn this door to ash," she shouted back, trying to keep her voice from shaking. A cruel laugh vibrated through the wood. "Bring the axes," Thorne commanded. The first blow of the axe splintered the ancient oak. The patients screamed. Julia closed her eyes, bracing for the end. The second blow cracked the wood down the middle. But the third blow never came. Instead, a strange, unnatural silence descended over the hospital. The wind outside stopped howling. The axes fell quiet. Then Julia heard it. It started as a low, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from the very stone beneath their feet. It was a rumble so deep it rattled the glass vials on the apothecary's shelves. Outside the high, arched windows, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the snow-covered courtyard in hues of bruised purple and pale gold. "Look," a wounded rebel whispered, pointing a trembling finger toward the window. Julia backed away from the door and moved to the glass. She looked down at the massive lower courtyard of St. Mathurin's. The heavy winter mist was parting, pushed aside by a sea of movement. Wolves, hundreds of them. But these were no ordinary timber wolves. They were the size of war horses, their fur a blinding, luminous silver. They wore forged plates of blackened steel armor across their chests and shoulders. They moved in perfect, terrifying unison, surrounding the hospital in a flawless ring of death. In the center of the courtyard, Montgomery's men were frozen in terror. Commander Thorne had dropped his axe. From the center of the silver pack, a single wolf stepped forward. He was larger than the rest, his fur the color of midnight and frost, his eyes a piercing, unnatural gold. He didn't run. He stalked forward with the arrogant grace of a king. As the giant wolf reached the center of the courtyard, a sickening crunch of bone echoed through the morning air. Right before Julia's horrified eyes, the beast's spine arched, his form shifting, snapping, and expanding until a man stood in the snow. He was devastatingly lethal to look at. Tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in dark leather and steel. His jaw was covered in dark stubble, his hair a messy, wind-swept black. But it was his eyes, those glowing golden eyes, that made Julia's breath hitch. This was not Lord Caldwell. This was Palin Ashford, the Alpha King of the Northern Wastes, a myth used to frighten children, a monster who hadn't been seen in human lands for a century. "Kill him!" Commander Thorne shrieked, drawing his broadsword. Kalin didn't even draw a weapon. He simply raised a hand, his long fingers tipped with dark, elongated claws. The slaughter was instantaneous. The silver wolves surged forward like a tidal wave of fur, fangs, and armor. Montgomery's elite mercenaries, men who had terrorized the valley for years, were torn to shreds in less than 3 minutes. The courtyard ran red, the snow melting beneath the sheer heat of the carnage. Julia stumbled back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had saved the hospital from the warlord, only to deliver it into the jaws of an apex predator. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the ward, not the chaotic stomping of mercenaries, but the slow, predatory gait of a single man. The remnants of the shattered oak door were ripped away from their iron hinges with a deafening crash. The heavy wooden cabinets Julia had used to barricade the entrance were tossed aside as if they weighed nothing. Kalin Ashford stepped into the ward. He was covered in the blood of Montgomery's men, his chest heaving slightly. The entire room recoiled in absolute terror. Beatrice fainted dead away. The wounded rebels gripped their weapons, but their hands shook so violently they were useless. Kalin ignored them all. His golden eyes swept the room, his nostrils flaring as he took a deep, dragging breath. He held something in his left hand. It was Julia's parchment. The blood-stained letter. He stepped over the debris, moving with terrifying speed, straight toward Julia. She raised the iron poker, stepping in front of the cowering patients. "Stay back," Julia warned, her voice breathless. Kalin stopped inches from her. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame. He looked down at the iron poker, then up into her eyes. A strange, violent emotion crossed his harsh features. He didn't strike her. Instead, he reached out and grabbed her wrist, the one wrapped in the bloody linen bandage. His grip was like a steel vice, immovable but surprisingly gentle. He lifted her hand to his face and pressed his nose against the blood-soaked fabric, inhaling deeply. A low, possessive growl vibrated in his chest, shaking Julia to her very core. "For 5 years," Kalin rumbled, his voice rough, like stone grinding against stone. "I have slaughtered kings, burned cities to the ground, and torn this continent apart looking for the woman who wore my mark." Julia's eyes widened in confusion. "I don't know what you're talking about. I sent that letter to the east. It was a mistake." Kalin's golden eyes locked onto hers, burning with a fierce, terrifying devotion. He dropped the parchment to the floor. The wax seal was broken, but the silver wolf's head was still visible. "There was no mistake," Kalin whispered, stepping into her space until she was backed against the stone wall. He reached up, his bloodied fingers gently brushing a stray curl from her face. "You summoned the Alpha King, little bird. And now that I have found my queen, I am never letting you go." "You are mistaken," Julia breathed, her spine pressing against the freezing stone wall of the ward. Her mind raced, struggling to process the towering, blood-soaked warlord looming over her. "I took that ring from a dead man, a nameless foot soldier who washed up on the muddy banks of the River Ouse 5 winters ago. His chest was torn open by a flail. He died on my operating table. I kept the ring so the corrupt monks wouldn't steal it." Kalin's lips curved into a smile that was entirely wolfish, revealing the sharpened tips of his canines. "I did not die, my fierce little healer, though Archbishop Thomas Arundel and his silver-armed inquisitors certainly tried." Julia's breath hitched in her throat. Her gaze dropped to the exposed expanse of his collarbone, tracing the thick, jagged white scar that disappeared beneath his leather armor. It was a scar she knew intimately. She had spent 12 hours stitching that horrifying wound under the flickering light of a tallow candle, her hands stained with his boiling, unnaturally hot blood. She had hidden his massive unconscious body in the crypts to protect him from the church's hounds, only to find him gone the next morning, leaving nothing behind but a shattered stone tomb and the heavy silver ring on her desk. "You were the soldier," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "But you were human." "I was dying," Kalen corrected, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to echo in her very bones. "Silver poisons my kind. It locks us in our human skin and drains our strength. When I staggered into this sanctuary, I was blind, bleeding out, and hunted by 100 of King Henry's men. You did not ask my allegiance. You did not demand coin. You simply washed my wounds with iodine and lavender, and anchored my soul to the living world with your bare hands." He stepped even closer, his sheer size completely eclipsing the faint morning light filtering through the stained glass. When my healing accelerated, the beast within me panicked. I awoke in a frenzy, trapped in a stone crypt, and broke out before my mind returned to me. By the time I regained my senses in the northern woods, I had lost your scent. For 5 years I have torn this realm apart, searching for the hands that smell of iodine and lavender, the hands that hold my signet. Julia looked past him, to the horrified patients huddled behind the barricades, and to the courtyard below, where his silver wolves were still tearing through the remnants of Montgomery's army. "The letter," Julia stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the blood-stained parchment on the floor. "I was trying to seal it with my family crest. I cut my hand. I used your ring by mistake." Kalen reached down, picking up her injured hand. His thumb traced the blood-soaked linen of her bandage. "There is no magic in this world older or more absolute than blood magic, Julia. When your blood touched the Lycanthian royal crest, it did not just summon me. It bound your scent to the ley lines of the earth. It screamed to my beast across 300 miles of winter forest that my queen was calling." "I am no one's queen," Julia snapped, yanking her hand away, though the friction of his touch left her skin burning with an inexplicable magnetic heat. "I am a healer, and you have brought a massacre to my hospital." "I have brought salvation," Kalen growled, his golden eyes narrowing. He gestured toward the shattered door. "Montgomery was only the vanguard. Did you truly think a petty baron had the resources to fund a siege on a neutral holy site? Montgomery was backed by Thomas of Lancaster, the Duke of Clarence. King Henry IV has decreed that your resistance fighters are traitors to the crown. A royal army of 5,000 men is marching up the valley right now. They will be here by nightfall, and they will burn St. Matherin's to the ground with everyone inside it." A suffocating silence fell over the ward. Beatrice, who had regained consciousness, began to weep into her apron. The wounded rebels exchanged looks of absolute despair. They had survived the Baron, but they could not survive the crown. "Then we fight," Julia said, her voice shaking but her chin held high. "Or we hide the patients in the catacombs." "You will die," Kalen stated bluntly. "My pack is strong, but 300 wolves cannot hold a stationary fortress against 5,000 archers equipped with liquid fire and silver-tipped bolts. We cannot stay here." He looked at her, his expression hardening into absolute, unbreakable authority. "You are coming with me to the Howling Peaks, under my protection." "And them?" Julia asked, gesturing fiercely to the orphans, the wounded, and the nurses. "I will not abandon my people to the king's fire." Kalen looked at the cowering humans. To an alpha king, they were weak, fragile, and utterly useless. But then he looked back at Julia. He saw the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes, the same light that had kept her standing over his bleeding body 5 years ago, when any other woman would have run. "They are your people," Kaelan murmured, bowing his head in a gesture of profound submission that sent shock waves through the watching rebels. "Which makes them my pack. Gather your wounded, my queen. We march north." The exodus from St. Matherin's was a grueling, desperate crawl through the freezing wilderness. Julia's people numbered just over 80, a fragile procession of wounded men leaning on makeshift crutches, shivering nurses, and frightened children swathed in every blanket the hospital possessed. Surrounding them was a moving fortress of silver fur and steel armor. Kaelan's wolves walked in perfect formation, their massive bodies shielding the humans from the biting valley winds. Kaelan himself remained in his human form, walking at Julia's side. He had offered her his royal mount, a terrifyingly large black stallion, but she had refused, choosing to walk in the snow alongside her patients. For 3 days, they pushed toward the jagged, ice-capped teeth of the howling peaks. The cold was a physical enemy, but the wolves shared their supernatural body heat, curling around the children at night like giant, breathing hearths. Julia found herself watching Kaelan when he wasn't looking. He was a creature of absolute violence, yet when an orphan girl had dropped her wooden doll into a snowdrift, the Alpha King had halted the entire caravan to retrieve it, handing it back with a gentleness that defied his terrifying reputation. But the brutal reality of the 15th century was catching up to them. On the afternoon of the 4th day, as they entered the narrow, treacherous gorge known as the Blythewood Pass, the air shifted. The wolves halted instantly, their ears flattening against their skulls. A collective low growl vibrated through the canyon. Kaelan threw his arm across Julia's chest, pushing her behind him. "Ambush!" he roared. Before the word fully left his lips, the high ridges of the gorge erupted in fire. The Duke of Clarence's men had not followed them from behind. They had bypassed the valley and cut them off at the pass. Catapults, hidden in the snowy cliffs, launched massive barrels of alchemist's fire down into the gorge. The snow exploded into green, unnatural flames. "Shield the humans!" Kaelan bellowed, his voice echoing with the ancient power of the Alpha Command. The silver wolves surged inward, forming a literal wall of armor and flesh over the screaming patients. A hail of arrows blackened the sky. But these were not iron arrows. As they struck the wolves, the beasts let out agonizing, human-like screams. "Silver!" Kaelan snarled, his golden eyes flashing. He drew a massive broadsword from his back, preparing to shift into his beast form to scale the cliffs. But as he moved, a figure broke from the huddled group of humans. It was Beatrice. The young nurse was sobbing hysterically, clutching a heavy velvet purse that chimed with the sickening sound of gold coins. It bore the royal crest of Lancaster. "I'm sorry!" Beatrice screamed, backing away toward the cliffs. "The Duke's spies found me in the village before the siege. They promised me passage to France if I led you to the pass. I didn't want to burn Julia. I'm sorry." "Beatrice, no!" Julia screamed, stepping forward. But Beatrice's betrayal had perfectly positioned them in the kill zone. From the highest ridge, a massive iron ballista fired. A spear-sized bolt of pure, unadulterated silver shrieked through the icy air, aimed directly at Julia's chest. She didn't even have time to blink. A blur of black leather and sheer, unstoppable muscle slammed into her. Kaelan threw himself into the projectile's path. The sickening crunch of tearing flesh and shattering bone echoed over the chaos. Julia was thrown into the snow, gasping for breath. When she looked up, her heart stopped entirely. Kaelan was pinned to the frozen earth, the massive silver bolt driven straight through his chest, mere inches from his heart. Black, boiling veins immediately began to spiderweb across his neck and face as the silver toxicity ravaged his immortal system. "Alpha!" The wolves howled in pure, unadulterated despair. Without Kaelin's commanding aura, their formation began to waver under the relentless rain of royal arrows. The human soldiers were beginning to rappel down the cliffs, drawing their steel swords. "Kaelin!" Julia scrambled through the snow, falling to her knees beside him. His golden eyes were flickering, fading to a dull, cloudy amber. He was choking on his own blood. "Run!" he wheezed, his massive blood-stained hand gripping her wrist with the last vestige of his strength. "Take the wolves. They will follow you, because of the mark. Run, my queen." "Shut up," Julia sobbed, her medical instincts violently overriding her terror. She was not in a sterile hospital ward. She was in a burning gorge, surrounded by monsters and kings, but she was still Julia Hastings. She tore open her medical satchel, dumping the contents into the snow. "Hold him down!" she screamed to 3 massive wolves fighting nearby. To her shock, the giant beasts instantly obeyed, pressing their heavy paws over Kaelin's thrashing limbs. "The silver is in his bloodstream," Julia muttered, her mind calculating wildly. "I can pull the bolt, but the poison will stop his heart in seconds. He needs an antidote. He needs—" She remembered the ancient texts in the hospital's forbidden library. Lycanthrians were bound by blood. A true mate, marked and claimed, possessed blood that acted as an absolute sovereign over the beast's biology. If she was his queen, her blood was the only cure. Julia grabbed a sterilized iron scalpel. She didn't hesitate. She pressed the blade to the palm of her left hand, right over the faint, healing scar from the wax seal, and sliced deep. "Julia!" "No!" Kaelin gasped, his body convulsing violently as the silver reached his heart. "You owe me a debt, Alpha King," Julia commanded, her voice ringing out with an unnatural, echoing authority that made the surrounding wolves whimper in reverence. "You do not have permission to die on my table twice." With a scream of exertion, Julia gripped the shaft of the silver ballista bolt and violently ripped it out of Kaelin's chest. A fountain of black blood erupted from the wound. Instantly, she slammed her bleeding palm directly over the gaping hole in his chest, pressing her open flesh against his torn heart. The moment their blood mixed, a blinding, concussive shockwave of pure energy blasted outward. The snow beneath them instantly vaporized into steam. The alchemist's fire burning around the gorge was snuffed out in a single, breathtaking vacuum of air. Julia gasped, her back arching as a terrifying, ancient power surged up her arm and flooded her veins. Her vision fractured into sharp, predatory focus. She could hear the heartbeats of the terrified royal soldiers on the cliffs. She could smell their fear. Beneath her hand, Kaelin's shattered chest violently knitted itself back together. The black veins vanished, replaced by a radiant, burning gold. Kaelin's eyes snapped open. They were no longer the eyes of a man. They were the eyes of a god of war. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the howling peaks, Kaelin shifted. He did not become a mere wolf. He exploded into an absolute nightmare of primeval destruction. A terrifyingly massive 14-foot beast of shadow and frost, crowned with a halo of dark energy. The royal army of the Duke of Clarence realized their fatal mistake, but it was far too late. Led by their fully restored Alpha, the 300 silver wolves became a localized apocalypse. The slaughter was absolute, a tempest of teeth and fury that wiped the king's elite vanguard from the face of the earth in less than 10 minutes. The snow ran a deep, unforgiving red. When silence finally returned to the gorge, Only the wailing wind remained. Julia stood amidst the carnage, her linen dress soaked in blood, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She felt different, stronger. The cold no longer bothered her. From the shadows of the gorge, the giant black wolf emerged. He was covered in the blood of his enemies. He walked slowly toward Julia, his massive head lowering until it was level with hers. Then, in a shower of dark mist, Cailan shifted back into his human form. He was breathing heavily, his golden eyes locked onto her with a reverence that bordered on religious worship. He dropped to one knee in the blood-stained snow, taking her bloody hand and pressing it to his forehead. "My life," Cailan rumbled, his voice echoing across the silent canyon. "My crown. My soul. They are yours, Julia. Now and for eternity." Behind him, 300 silver wolves bowed their heads in perfect unison. Behind them, Julia's patients and nurses fell to their knees in awe. Julia Hastings looked down at the Alpha King, the heavy silver ring still resting safely in her pocket. She had called him by mistake, seeking a mere human cavalry. Instead, she had summoned an empire. She gently pulled Cailan to his feet, interlacing her fingers with his. "Let us go home," the true Queen of the North commanded. And together, they walked into the winter storm. Did you love the breathtaking twists of Julia and Cailan's story? If you want to dive deeper into more thrilling romance, dark fantasy, and heart-pounding werewolf dramas, hit that subscribe button right now. Don't forget to leave a like, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with your friends. Tell us your favorite moment in the comments below. We release new gripping stories every single week, so join our pack today and never miss an epic, thrilling adventure.